I'm sorry we missed the first bit, but I will continue. On the one hand, we were all there and we received Torah. On the other hand, we received the Torah in a way that we could understand it. So this relates to the idea of 70 faces of Torah, which means that there are 70 interpretations. 70 is another rabbinic number, and basically what 70 means is infinite. When the rabbis talk about 70, they're talking about infinite. They're talking about infinity. And so 70 faces of Torah really means infinite faces of Torah, which really means as many interpretations as you can imagine. And because I only had 18 minutes, I had to focus on certain sources. I also, at the time, again, this was 4.5 years ago, if I were to do this talk today, I would probably add an additional 5 to 10 sources to it. But we are at our points in life, and I was able to build a really robust talk on the sources that I did use. And so I'm going to focus on the sources that I did use there, and I'm going to actually, in the end, bring in a few more that I would have brought in had I had the time and had I had the resources and ability to do so. This talk, as you can imagine, could have gone on for a while, but of course, we had to keep it to 18 minutes, which I think is a really great number for so many reasons. So we have this idea of the 70 faces of Torah. And therefore, if there are infinite numbers of interpretations of Torah, then that means that the more people we have revealing Torah that they understand or have received. And again, this is not Torah that is somehow like floating in thin air. This is all rooted in the Torah that we received collectively. My point in this talk is to say that if we all were there collectively to receive Torah, then the more of us who are able to be in community together means that the Torah that we get to learn and teach from one another is that much more robust because we have more people and more experiences in the mix. And so I then kind of shift to talking about the ways in which people with disabilities, and I use that term, that is a relatively modern term. It's one that I use all the time, but I'm about to make a disclaimer, which is that we're going to talk for a moment about biblical text, and then we're going to move to talking about rabbinic text. And of course, the term disability was not a term that was used in either the Torah or the Talmud. It's a term that I'm using because it's the term that we're using today in the modern world. And I also think it's important to say that we have to be very aware of what terms were and were not used in the context of the texts that we're learning. It's very important intellectually for me and out of a sense of integrity to the text that we are cautious about how we apply contemporary language. And at the same time, I think it's really important for us as contemporary people to be able to connect to these ancient texts. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but it's one that I think is really important to maintain. So we start with the Torah. One of the first things I talk about in the Eli talk is that in the book of Genesis, in literally the first parak, the first chapter of Torah, we get an idea that on the one hand is so simple and on the other hand is so incredibly radical that we still don't fully live it out today. And that idea is that every single human being is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. We've all probably heard this term a lot in Jewish circles. We're all created in the image of God, and therefore we have inherent dignity and value and worth, etc. But there's a lot of conversation about what does it exactly mean to be created in the image of God? And as I just said, it could mean having inherent dignity, value, and worth as a human being that is unique and unlike any other human being. It also could be understood as, like in a very famous Mishnah from Sanhedrin, from a rabbinic text called the Mishnah, which was codified in the land of Israel in about 200, the Common Era. Common Era means, so because as Jews, we certainly don't reference ourselves according to the Christian calendar. So like, for example, we're in the year 2022, according to the Christian Gregorian calendar, and the designation is AD, which I think is something to do with after the death in Latin. I don't know the exact Latin phrase. That is not something that we as Jews mark our time by, right? We don't mark our time by the death of Jesus of Nazareth. So when we are dating things Jewishly by the Gregorian calendar, the term that gets used for the era that we are in right now is the Common Era, and then the era that the Gregorian calendar often refers to as BC, before Christ, is known in academic parlance as before the Common Era. That is simply a way of using the reality of the dominance of the Christian calendar when we're talking about dating Jewish texts according to it. We just don't use CE and we don't use BC and AD, we use CE and BCE. So sorry for that little aside. I just wanted to describe when I said Common Era, what I meant by that. So the Mishnah is this corpus of oral law, and the Talmud is built upon the Mishnah. There's a very famous Mishnah. It's in Tractate Sanhedrin, which is actually about civil law, and it's in a tractate, or it's in a order of Mishnah called damages. And Nizikin, or damages, contains multiple sections on tort law and civil law of all kinds. So there's a Mishnah that shows up in Sanhedrin, which basically talks about that just as when coins are stamped, they are stamped with a unique seal, so too does Hashem, does God, does the divine create human beings one unique from the next, to remind us all that we are actually deeply unique and treasured. And that way also we cannot say that one person's blood is redder than another, that no one is more holy, no one is above another. And I think that directly connects to Genesis 1:27, that we're created in the image of God. And from there, I go on to describe the ways in which some individuals in Torah and in rabbinic tradition, who we might call people with disabilities today, talk about or think about themselves in the larger cultures in which they find themselves. And the point that I'm making in that is to say that people with disabilities have always existed. It is not as though since the 1960s, when the disability rights movement began in the United States, that's not when disability became a category. There have always been disability. There have always been people with disabilities. The ways in which people talked about themselves have changed over time. But I wanted to show that that was actually true based on very famous texts in Torah and Talmud. So very briefly, in Torah, we have a very famous scene in the book of Exodus, in the 4th chapter of Exodus, Exodus 4, verses 10 to 16. And in this dialogue, we have a dialogue between God and Moses. And Moses is not that excited about being tasked with bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt. This feels really relevant and timely right now to be talking about this text. So Moses is saying, well, I'm not really interested. Like, I can't do this job. I'm a person who doesn't speak very fluently, very fluidly. When we say fluently or fluidly, what we mean there is that someone has a speech impediment, meaning that they might struggle with articulating verbal, physical speech. And so Moses was saying to God, well, that's my experience. I am someone who struggles with verbal and physical speaking. And God says to Moses, and Moses at this point had been really demurring and saying, like, I don't really want to do this. I'm nervous. You know, we can imagine all kinds of reasons why that would be the case. And God says to Moses, well, I made you in my image. I made you in my image, and you are worthy like anyone else. And I'm going to give you a reasonable accommodation. Your brother Aaron speaks really well, and he will speak for you. And you will tell him what to say, and he will put the words that you say to him in his mouth, and then everyone else will hear. And I want to just lift up the incredible work of a dear friend who recently passed away, Cheryl Grossman, may her memory be for a blessing, who, in addition to being a very powerful disability activist, was also an Orthodox Jewish woman. And she really taught me how to read this passage in a very radical way. She argues that this is a passage in Torah in which people with disabilities are given the ability to have accommodations of any variety, including personal attendant care. That's the way that she read it. Now, personal attendant care has to do with like home care issues, but this can be read more broadly, because in this situation, we have a situation in which God has decided that Moses is the person for the job. And of course, Moses' speech impediment is a part of who he is. And God says to him effectively that exact thing, that I made you as you are, and I'm going to give you a reasonable accommodation because I know that you are the person for the job. So when we think about a reasonable accommodation, that's obviously a term that the Torah did not know, but a lot of people in disability circles are reading this passage that way because God says to Moses very powerfully, well, I have a solution to this problem. And because God is God, God can do whatever God wants. And God says, I have a solution. You are the person to do this job, and your brother Aaron will be your spokesperson. And you will tell Aaron what to say, and he will vocalize it for everyone else. So that right there is a very powerful passage for me and for many others, because in our Torah, in our most sacred literature, we have an affirmation that Moses is who Moses is, that God has elected, has chosen Moses for this role, and that God understands that Moses's disability is a part of who he is as a human being, and that therefore there are ways that that needs to be accommodated. That is a very powerful read. And how does that relate back to the idea of everyone receiving Torah? It relates because Moses is inherently part of the community. He, in fact, is the one who receives Torah on Har Sinai. We are all there, but ultimately we get so freaked out because we've got all the thunder and all the lightning and the cloud, and God's in the cloud, and we're like, I don't know what to do. We're freaking out. It's like, this is too much. And we basically beg Moses to go up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights and receive Torah and then transmit it to us. It's even said, that's even really said in Exodus 20, I believe. And so that is a really fundamental text. And then we're going to take a turn to the rabbinic period. And in the Talmud, there is a lot of mention of disability. Again, not using the term disability, but using the concept and category, particularly visible disability. And in particular, there are several rabbis in the Talmud who are blind. They are portrayed in the text as full human beings with all kinds of viewpoints, some of them having to do directly with blindness, most of them having nothing to do with that and having to do with many other things. They were active contributors in the Beit Midrash. They gave halakhic rulings. They had students, they had disciples, they had schools. And as a rabbinical student, and I talk about this in the Eli talk, as a rabbinical student, it was powerful beyond measure for me to find these rabbis in these texts, because I was the consummate outsider in my rabbinical school. I was very lucky that I had lots of friends and lots of people who really wanted me to succeed. But the reality is, my rabbinate was very different than the rabbinates of all of my classmates in lots of ways. And it had nothing to do with the choices we made career-wise. It had everything to do with who we were, what our life experiences were, all of that. So simply by being in rabbinical school, that in and of itself was shifting how people thought about who could become a rabbi. And that in and of itself is a really important conversation to have. So for me, finding these rabbis in the text, again, all male, of course, because we're talking about the Talmud, although there are very learned women in the Talmud as well, was really important for me to have that mentorship. And I talk about that a little bit in the talk, particularly when it comes to how Rav Sheshet, who is one of the two rabbis, and Rav Yosef, the other rabbi, talk about themselves and talk about their blindness. And they do so, there are a couple of instances, and I'm going to refer to two of them now, but there are a couple of instances in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, where Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshet realize that they are experiencing an injustice, that they are experiencing a deep religious injustice, and they want that to be rectified. And they stand up in the Beit Midrash and they say, why should the fact that I'm a blind man preclude me from participating in this religious act. So the first text that we're going to talk about in that regard, I need to very quickly pause and give a background. So in rabbinic understanding, religious mitzvot, when we think of the term mitzvah, sometimes we think good deeds, sometimes we think be nice to each other. Those are great things, right? That is certainly one way to understand mitzvah. In the rabbinic tradition, a mitzvah is a religious act. And depending on who you are, you may or may not have a certain level of what is called chiyuv, or obligation, to perform a certain action. And the way that the rabbinic understanding worked is that if you have the same level of obligation to do a religious function at a particular time or in a particular way, you can dispense that obligation for someone who has the same level of obligation. So let me put that another way. This is why, at least as conservative Jews, we think about minyan as 10 adult Jews. And I say adults because in the conservative community and the conservative movement, we count all adults above the age of bar and bat mitzvah for a minyan. We don't count kids. Why? Because our tradition understands that a person is not obligated to pray in a particular way until they reach the age of Jewish majority. So that means that before a child becomes b'nai mitzvah, they aren't able to lead services in synagogue in the same way that they can once they become b'nai mitzvah. It's a way of showing that you are a member in a community. So at the time of the Rabbi, at the time of the Talmud being codified, and the Talmud was very much a living document. We tend to think now of the Talmud as these big books with all these folios and all this ancient stuff that we can barely understand. Well, the Talmud, when it was being codified, was a living document. It records debates and discussions and back and forth and this and that between rabbis of different generations, between rabbis of the same generation. And they're trying to figure out, so now we don't have a temple anymore in Yerushalayim. Most of us are living in Bavel, in current day Iraq. We've been here a while. We're trying to figure out, how do we keep this thing going without the temple in Yerushalayim, and with the fact that the Jewish communities in the land of Israel right now are under tremendous oppression with the Roman occupation. How do we keep this situation? How do we keep our tradition going when we don't have that central axis? So the rabbis are figuring this out, and they figure out, okay, so prayer is going to replace sacrifices, and religious obligation is going to replace going to the temple, because it's all interconnected. But excuse me. But who is obligated? Who is actually obligated to offer those religious things? Give me 1 second. I'm just going to grab a quick sip of water. Who is obligated to offer particular things at particular times? And there's an understanding that if you are obligated and you perform your obligation, so if I'm obligated to pray shachrit in the morning and I pray shachrit in the morning, then I get mitzvah points for doing that, or I get rewarded. That's how the rabbis refer to it. Now, reward, we could talk about what does that mean. We're going to put that aside. That's not our topic for today. And there's an idea that if I am not obligated and I still perform a mitzvah, that I don't get rewarded in the same way. So in other words, greater is the one who is commanded and performs than is the one who is not commanded and yet performs. This is the very famous rabbinic idea, which might feel really counterintuitive to us as modern people. So at this point, we can presume that Rabbi Yosef is not obligated, because he stands up and he says, wait a second, if somebody says to me that I, a blind man who's not obligated to do all these religious things, I still do them, I should make a banquet for the rabbis. Basically, I should throw a huge party in my own honor because I get this great reward, I'm doing this thing that I'm not obligated to do. But then I find out from Rav Hanina, another one of his colleagues, that actually I'm not rewarded because I'm not obligated. Well, that doesn't feel right to me. Why should I not be obligated? Why should I not be part of this system? This was an important system for him. He's saying, why should I not be part of that system, be part of that mechanism? And in fact, because he stands up and he says, like, no, I am fulfilling all of these religious obligations and I am not obligated. I don't think that's right. I should be equally obligated. That is where we derive until this day that, with a few exceptions, which we're not going to get into today, but with a few exceptions, blind people are obligated in mitzvot in no difference than sighted people. So putting that another way, generally speaking, a blind Jewish adult has the exact same religious obligations that a sighted Jewish adult does. In our day and age, that is basically true across the board. And that is because Rav Yosef said, I am not willing to be in a society or in a system where I have schools of disciples, I have plenty of colleagues, I'm learning all of this Torah all the time, I'm making halakhic rulings, and yet I'm not obligated in the same way that my colleagues are. That needs to change. So that is a tremendous shift. And the second thing that I want to bring out, and we're going to kind of draw this to a close in a moment, we're going to draw the Eli talk portion to a close, and then I'm going to just summarize, and then we're going to open it up for some Q&A, is this feels really relevant to where we are in the calendar. In Masechet Psachim, in the 10th chapter, which is a really amazing and important chapter, it's the chapter that talks about the Pesach Seder, and the rabbis are trying to figure out what is a Seder, how does the Seder work, what do we do? There is an anecdote in that chapter where people are asking, are blind people obligated to recite the Haggadah? And there's a very intricate rabbinic argument as to maybe they are, maybe they aren't. We're not going to get into so much of that today. It's a logical inference that in the context of the Talmud makes sense, but we'll see in a moment how it gets overturned. Are blind people obligated to recite the Haggadah? Well, one rabbi says, well, I don't know. You know how it says, Rabban Gamliel says there are three things you have to refer to in order to have officially fulfilled your Pesach obligation, right? What is matzah? What is the Pesach sacrifice? And what is maror? We got to talk about what are those three things? Why do we have them? And why do we eat them on Pesach? If we don't talk about those things, we haven't fulfilled our obligation and we haven't done a Seder properly. So, okay, if we have to point to those things and a blind person can't point, well, does that mean that a blind person can't read the Haggadah or say the Haggadah? Now, at this point, we can assume, I think, that when people are talking about does a blind person have the same obligation to say the Haggadah, I think what we're actually probably talking about more is, does a blind person have an obligation in Magid, in telling the story, right? Because the actual obligation on Seder night is you got to tell a vincha, and you will tell your child. The fact that we use this printed Haggadah to get there is a later invention. The real obligation here is telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, and doing so in a lengthy way is a praiseworthy thing. And so this question arises, are blind people obligated in this? And so in response to this, one rabbi is saying, I don't know, are blind people obligated? I'm not sure. Someone says, well, Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshet, I know for a fact, because I've heard it from their students, that in their households, they are the ones who lead the Seder. So clearly, blind people are totally obligated and totally have the same rights to do so as anybody else. And the reason that text is very powerful, I think, especially given the context that these texts are occurring in, right, is that basically Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshet don't wait around for permission. They're not like, well, I don't know, can I do this? Right? Whose permission do I need to ask? They're like, I'm not asking anybody's permission. Yes, I'm doing this. And this is how it's going to roll. And they just do it. They lead the Seder. So that's it. And so that is powerful in that they're not asking anyone's permission. They're saying, this is what we're doing. We're part of this project, and that's all we have to say about that. And that, again, is people with disabilities realizing, hey, there's something going on here that isn't right. Let me actually figure out a way to make this system better, right? Because if we don't have all voices at the table, then we're not able to really capture ways in which the society can be made better for everyone. And it might have been threatening to the one rabbi who was not so sure that a blind person could say the Haggadah, could say Magid and Seder night. That might have been threatening. Well, what happens if the mitzvah is done a little differently than the way I'm used to? Part of what it means for all of us to build really robust and diverse communities is figuring out a way to grapple with our own feelings around change, asking hard questions of ourselves, and figuring out how we move together collectively. That was ultimately where I wanted to conclude the talk. And if I were to do it today, I would add a few more pieces from Talmud, and I would build out a little bit more of the theology. But fundamentally and ultimately, what I want to get across are a couple of really important takeaways. Inclusion is relational, not transactional. So we know that communities can become inclusive when we actually have a relationship with someone. It's not about, okay, I'm going to pay my, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to build the ramp, and therefore we're now inclusive. It's great, I have this ramp, hopefully that can bring more people into the community. And at the same time, how do I ensure that people in my community feel welcome there? And that is a multi-pronged thing that we all have to do. It's on every one of us. And there are lots of ways that we can get there. Tonight, we're not going to do so much of a deep dive on exactly what you do, how you do it. We can certainly find another time if you want to bring me back to do that kind of workshop. But it's very important to start with an emphasis on relationship building. Because if we don't have those bonds of community, I was actually on a call with some colleagues earlier today, and we were talking about how sometimes the term community gets bandied around so much that it almost loses meaning, right? What does it actually mean to be in community with one another? It's not only about rhetorical usage. It's really an active process that we have to step up and engage in. It's not a simple, straightforward process. It's deeply active. And it's also saying that when we bring in more voices, we're going to have a more diverse community. We're going to have more of a richer understanding of Torah. And I would have brought, if I was able to then, and I will now, what scholars call the deposition of Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi, who was the head of the Beit Midrash in Bavel, in Babylonia. And this is talked about in Masechet Brachot. And why is Rabban Gamliel deposed? Well, one could argue, is it because he insults Rabbi Yehoshua over the question of whether or not reciting the evening prayer is obligatory? We're going to put that whole conversation aside for now. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. Was he deposed because he disputed with Rabbi Yehoshua about that issue? Or was he deposed because he had a guard at the Beit Midrash door, meaning that, as he often said, if a student's outsides are not like their insides, they are not welcome in the Beit Midrash, meaning that this space is a closed space. And the rabbis said, well, that's not okay. We need to bring Torah to Israel, right? We need to bring Torah to the people of Israel, and therefore we need to find a new Nasi, a new leader. And they ask themselves, well, who is the right person? Is it Rabbi Yehoshua? Well, that can be a little bit complicated if he automatically succeeds Rabban Gamliel, given that they've had this, given that there has been this disputation, or maybe even more accurately, this humiliation of Rabbi Yehoshua. Then they say, well, could it be Rabbi Akiva? And they worry that Rabbi Akiva could be easily attacked because of who he is and his background. They don't want to put him in that position. And so then they settle on Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who ultimately succeeds Rabban Gamliel. And when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who we'll see in about 10 days from now in Haggadah, that's where the very famous line of I was like a man of 70. I was 18, but I was like a man of 70. I think that's the quote. It's very early in Magid. When Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah becomes the Nasi, the head of the Beit Midrash, he effectively, there's a difference of opinion. Were 400 benches placed in the Beit Midrash, or were 700? Meaning, how many extra seats for all of the students who began flooding into the Beit Midrash were put into the Beit Midrash when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the head of the Beit Midrash? And Rabban Gamliel says, woe is me if I inadvertently caused Israel to not receive all of the Torah that Israel could have received, if I did not allow into the Beit Midrash all of these people who could have been part and parcel of this community. And so that is about leadership and how our communities are coming together. So when we are building these inclusive communities, it means that we have to grapple with discomfort, but it also means that we grow, right? We grow from discomfort, but we do so productively, and we have to also recognize that we are bringing in people who have lots of different experiences and lots of different Torah to teach. That's not always going to resonate. The Torah that one person teaches does not always resonate with me. Sometimes different kinds of understandings of Torah resonate differently. And that ultimately is what it means to live in a community and be part of a people that received Torah together and also in ways that we each individually could understand. So I'm going to close my presentation now, and I'm going to open it up for some Q&A. And so, Ilana, I defer to you. If we want to call on folks, or if we want to have folks write into the chat, I defer to you for that.
If you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
I don't have any questions, but my name is Debbie, and I had my camera off, but I was here. I just want to say it's a very interesting presentation, and inclusion and inclusivity has always been something that I've been involved with for many years. I used to teach, and that was the background. So it was interesting to hear from a rabbinical perspective, because I've really never heard that angle before.
Thank you, Debbie.
You're very welcome.
I have a question, Alana. My name is Frida, Rabbi Tuchman. I really enjoyed your presentation very much, and for some of it, I was completely lost. I'm sorry.
No, I understand. Please ask me any clarifying questions.
When you were talking about blind people and other disabled people taking part, you use the word obligation, and I hear that word all the time. Whenever we have any discussion of Judaism, really, it's always an obligation, an obligation, an obligation. And I sort of upset with that word. I don't feel that it should be an obligation to read Torah. It should be a pleasure, an honor, a joy. Why do we always use that term obligation? We are obliged, and therefore blind people aren't obliged. It kind of bothers me, because it should be a joyful thing and not an obligation.
Frida, I totally hear you, and I thank you for the question. And I'm so sorry if anyone else experienced a little bit of the presentation. It's confusing. Please do not hesitate to ask me any clarifying questions. Yes, so the question that you're asking about, why do we use the term obligation? I think it's such a crucial question. And this ultimately gets to a point that I wish I'd brought up earlier, and I'm so grateful that you're asking now so that I can bring it up now. This is where language translation gets really complicated, because in English, right, we hear the word obligation and we hear, oh, I'm obliged. have to do this thing. It's not something I want to do, it's something I have to do, right? And there's that sense of like, like not choosing it, not having agency. And in Hebrew, chiyuv or obligation in a religious context doesn't really have the same valence. It is absolutely true that if a person lives a very Jewish, a very halachic, a very Jewish legal lifestyle, they might say, I have an obligation to pray 3 times a day. They might say, I have to go to minyan 3 times a day, whatever it is. And for a lot of people, it kind of feels like a chore and not like a joy. And that's not at all what Judaism, I believe, is meant to be at all. I think actually that the idea of obligation, if we think about it a little bit differently, and maybe we need a different term. I actually think that that's a conversation that perhaps we need to have, where the translation of chiyuv to obligation is not serving us. I think that that's true actually of a lot of translations between English and Hebrew. We're just working in 2 vastly different languages with 2 vastly different assumptions. So if we're working in this imperfect translation, maybe we could say we have a responsibility to be part of a community so that we show up for others. Really, that's ultimately what this is about. So when Rav Yosef is saying, I don't have the same obligation, really what he's saying is, I feel disconnected from my community because I'm doing all of these things, but I don't feel a part of my community, and I want to be a part of my community. And I also want to say, this framing, even as I'm reframing it, this is not going to work for everybody. This doesn't work for a lot of people today. A lot of people do not think about Judaism at all in terms of obligation. That methodology, that way of thinking is not working for lots of modern people for lots of reasons all over the Jewish world. And I think that that's a really important conversation to open up. What he's doing, I believe, in his context is saying, I want to be in my community and I don't feel like I'm included, and I want to be included in the system that I have. So I hope that that's somewhat illuminating, and I really appreciate the question.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It is illuminating. Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
Jane, go ahead, please.
She's muted.
Unmute yourself, Jane.
Okay, my name is Jane, and I wanted to pick up on the word inclusion. I think it's a very important word, and it's not, there's different levels of inclusion. For somebody who has limited vision, we have large print texts. For somebody who is mobility impaired, as my husband is, we have certain ramps and things per maybe the ADA Act or whatever. For people who are deaf, I know a community we belong to in Wayne, New Jersey, they would have a special section for people who were deaf, and they would have a sign interpreter there. However, you can call that inclusion, but inclusion also goes deeper. It's the attitude of those who are including them. So if you have a ramp, but the ramp really isn't accessible, so that people really can't, who can't walk, really can't get on the bima and move around and have an aliyah or continue to be in the choir. Or when I was in Wayne, New Jersey, yes, they had this signing section, and but some of the members would say that's very distracting. So were they really they were doing the right thing and the right, they probably were properly motivated, but to take it to the full extent, there needs to be some change maybe, or education in the attitude of the whole kahila to really include wholeheartedly. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's a note with me.
Jane, thank you so much for that. You are absolutely correct that we have to shift attitudes. And often this is something that's talked about in disability community, right? That the biggest barrier is the attitudinal barrier. And one of the things that I add to that, and people ask me, well, what are we going to do to change this, right? Because as you're saying, if somebody's got a ramp and it's not accessible, I mean, how many of those have we all experienced, right? Like, how many times have we been in places where we're like, oh, that's supposed to be a wheelchair ramp, but I'm pretty sure a person in a wheelchair couldn't actually use that ramp, right? You know, the barriers are everywhere. And so you're right that attitudes have to shift. But this is the next step that I think we often miss. And I think that especially in the world we're living in right now, this is really important and it's really hard to do because there's such misinformation and misunderstanding out there. But the way that I always tell people this is that if you want to really do inclusion well, you have to be willing to be educated, right? I could go and give a workshop on here are all the things that a synagogue could do to be a more inclusive space, right? And just like the community you were mentioning in New Jersey, having the signing section and all of those things, I could say, you know, here are the things you could do to become a more, but if you're not actually interested in growing, then where has that workshop gone, right? So we can say attitudinal barriers need to change, totally. But people need to be open to being changed. And that's not anything that we can do for other people. The only people that ultimately I think we can change are ourselves. We have to make the active choice, every single one of us. I think about this in my own life all the time. I have to actively choose to change the way I think all of the time. And I have to actively find ways when I'm noticing that there is something that's being introduced to me. This happens a lot to me. Something's being introduced to me, I don't understand it, it doesn't make sense to me, it doesn't fall into the kind of ways that I've been taught to understand the world and that I've come to understand the world. That's weird. Why should I accommodate that thing? Is that even real? You know, and I have to then make the choice and say, this is real. I don't need to understand it, right? And to say, like, I don't need to be able to relate as if it were my story because it's not my story. But what I need to be able to do is I need to be able to trust that growing and becoming a more inclusive and a better human being is not only to my advantage, it's to the advantage of the entire community. And it's my obligation. And this is where I'm going to use the term obligation. It is my obligation. If I want to be part of a really beautiful and rich human community, then I have to find ways. So maybe I find the signing distraction. I mean, although in my case, I'm going to say this in a self-deprecating way. That's not something I worry about so much. I'm happy to, you know, I am obviously not bothered at all by signing, but let's say there's something else that's getting on my, you know, that I'm finding distracting. So whatever that is, maybe there are people in a room who have disabilities that result in them making different kinds of vocalizations. And maybe I remember as a child, I used to find that very distracting and I didn't really know what to do with that. And so because I didn't know what to do with that, I'd be like, well, that's weird. And I would, you know, because I was a child and I didn't have a good filter, sometimes I would say things like, that's weird. Why does that sound so weird? You know, and I learned very quickly, like, okay, things might be distracting, but I have choice and agency. So basically what I'm saying to you, Jane, is in response to what you said is you're completely right. And we have to make that choice. No one can do it for us. We can be brought in to help that decision be made in a good way. But ultimately, when people ask me, you know, what can we as people with disabilities do to make other people comfortable with us? One of the things that I say is, well, ultimately, there's actually not a ton you can do. You can be the best person that you can be. That's something that I hope we all do, is live the best lives we can. But ultimately, I have to make the choice that I want to grow and that I want to be more comfortable with more people. So I hope that that is somewhat in response and kind of backing up what you've just said, because you're completely correct. And that's a really important point.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
My name is Davy, and I have a different take on inclusion, and feel free to say you don't want to answer if you don't want to, but
No,
I
please
want
share.
I want to talk about inclusion in terms of something like sexual orientation, inclusion in terms of race, or biracial, or things like that. So I want to take it to a different level and hear if you have any comments. Disability, I'm not, and believe me, I'm not demeaning or, ignoring. I believe physical disabilities are need to be acknowledged and accepted. But I think in the world we live in now, there's a lot of other areas of inclusion that need to be addressed as well in Judaism.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Sadie, for saying that. I think you're right. I think it's very important to bring that up. And one of the things that I really want to encourage us to do, right, is when we think about inclusion, is it's so easy for all of us, and I say especially in the disability community, we tend to get into this place where it's either us or it's other people, right? If I'm working on my own inclusion, that means that your inclusion is not something that's important to me. And I want to encourage all of us to break out of that way of thinking. So as a person with a disability, for example, right, I think that a community that is really queer inclusive, that is extremely inclusive of Jews from all backgrounds, is inherently a better community for all of us to be in. That all of these things we're all part of one community in one way or another, like we're part of a larger community, that has all the different congregations within it, but we're all part of one people. So if we're working towards inclusion for everybody, then that's going to make us a stronger people, right? That it's not one issue area. This is about people's lives and people's ability to be in the Jewish community together. And some of my best allies in this work are people who come at inclusion from lots of different perspectives. And I think that all of those things coming together is really what we need. What we don't need, I think, is what we've had for a long time, and this is starting to change. And there is good reason for it, which we're not going to go into tonight, but there's good historical reason for it. But I'm really looking forward to the day when we can kind of get out of that place of, well, the disability community is over here and we do our thing, and the anti-racist community is over here and we do our thing. No, I want to build an anti-racist community that is also disability inclusive. So that's all to say, but yes, you're absolutely right. There's not only one area, and I think we are all benefiting when actually we're all working together because we care about one another and we want everyone to feel welcome in a space.
Thank you for that. I appreciate your comments very much. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Rabbi, this is Debbie again. So I'm also just kind of thinking about what everybody's been saying. And I think that a lot of it boils down to we have to value everybody as a whole person. And I think that people, whether consciously or unconsciously, come with assumptions and make judgments. So if you see somebody or hear somebody that looks different or sounds different, or to what Jane was saying, the difference is making an accommodation is not an inclusion. That's two different things altogether. And I think you make assumptions, and until you realize that every person is a valued whole person, regardless of if it's from what you're saying, Shavy, but everybody is whole, regardless of the color or the gender or the mental health or the physical health, any of that. I think it's these underlying assumptions that create barriers to full inclusion, where you really see each person as a whole member of the community.
Thank you, Debbie. And Shavy, I'm so sorry that I got your name wrong. Please accept my apologies. I do apologize for that. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, you're completely, yes, that's a beautiful comment, Debbie. And absolutely, I think that really what this work asks of us, it's a lot because it's really hard. And I think we're seeing the ways in which people, I think in our culture today, and I'm not here to make comments on everything going on in the world. That's not where we're going tonight. But I do think that we are witnessing right now what happens when people don't want to engage in that reflection, right? So if I am made aware, right, of something I said that shows a bias that I'm carrying, right? This is where we have to get, there's an idea, I think, in American culture that really is very detrimental to this work, which is that if I say something prejudicial, I am inherently a bad person. Now, I'm not in any way saying that prejudice is a good thing, right? We all have it, we all need to work on it, right? And we all, and when we do harm, we as Jews, we have a process for doing tshuva, which I think actually, there's going to be a book coming out about this later. I think it's a really good model for the world, actually, is our model of tshuva. But that's all to say that, like, we do have assumptions. We do need to be aware of them and find ways to just every day do better. When I say do better, what I mean is just be aware of them. Try to act differently today than you did yesterday. This is not about saying, I'm a horrible person. Look at all these horrible, there are people who do really awful things in the world. And we're seeing that, of course, in so many ways right now. There's no way to discount that. There's no way to excuse that, right? That is a part of the world, and it is deplorable. And there are ways, most of us everyday people doing the best we can are coming with a lot of assumptions. We all do. And we have an obligation, I think we do have an obligation to question our own assumptions in ways that are productive for us so that we can move into a space that is more generative and more open and more allowing everyone to be a whole person, just as you said.
It's Shady again, and your opening comments just struck me. If we could all remember that we're all created in God's image, if we can just remember that when we deal with other people, no matter what they look like, no matter what they can or can't do, say or can't say, that we're all created in God's image and we all need to respect each other. And that really something I need to remember every day. Thank you for that.
Thank you. It's something I certainly need to remember every day as well.
This has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much, Rabbi Tuchman. And I like how on the note we ended, it kind of goes back to what Rabbi Goldsmith spoke about this past Shabbat, about seeing everyone as a whole person. And I think that this is just the beginning of this discussion for our community. And I really, really appreciate your taking the time, Rabbi Tuchman, to bring this to our community. And for anyone, I sent out the source sheets, but if anyone wants a printout copy, aren't able to print it out yourself, I have them in the office, so feel free to stop by. And also, if you did not have the opportunity to watch Rabbi Tuchman's Eli Talk, the link is on our website still.
Wonderful.
So thank you, Rabbi Tuchman. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for this beautiful conversation, and I hope it was really illuminating for your community.
It really was. Thank you so much.
It definitely was, and I thank all of our participants, and I want to wish everyone a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you, and happy Pesach.
Happy
Pesach.
Pesach.
Happy Pesach. This is Pesach to everyone.
Listen, Pesach, yes.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Have a good night.